Good afternoon. Today is November 2nd, 2017. My name is Sophia Cataldo, and I'm here with Patrick Conneely, the Irish skipper. Today we are participating in the Newton Talks Oral History Project that is being conducted with the Newton Free Library, Historic Newton, and the Newton Senior Center. What country are you originally from, and why did you leave your country?
I'm originally from Ireland, the island of Ireland, and I was born in Galway City, New Docks, and I immigrated to the United States October 30th, 1953.
Can you tell us about your experience leaving your country?
Pardon?
Can you tell us about your experience leaving your country?
The harbour I left from was called the Harbour of Tears, because that's where all immigrants usually came from. Cork Harbour, the British call it Queenstown, and that's where the Titanic sailed from in 1912. And it was an emotional part for me, but being a merchant mariner and a commercial fisherman, traveling was nothing new to me. World War II, most of our men and women, 1939, Churchill declared war against the Nazis, and most of our young men and women went into the British forces. The young people there had to take up the slack. If you came from a farming people, you worked the farms. If you were seafaring, you worked on the trawlers. At 10 years old, I was working on a trawler with my dad, who was a skipper. They were dangerous waters because even though we maintained our neutral, in spite of Churchill threatening to blow us off the face of the earth if we maintained our neutrality, our president, who was born in New York, said to Mr. Churchill, "Before you start shooting into the Irish Republic, I advise you to look to your left and look to your right and see who's in your 8th Army." And remember the rebellion in 1922, 1916. And Churchill backed off, and we maintained our neutrality. But no, we had to have our own ships, and we had to scurry around to the countries of the world to buy our own ships to keep the lifeline open to Ireland. But the fishing boats which I was on were on the top of the hit list for the U-boats. They didn't torpedo it. They would use it with gun practice from a gun deck. They also mined the approaches to Ireland. And again, they had the acoustic mines and they had the magnetic mines. The acoustic mines was the most dangerous because at magnetic you could see them. The acoustics you couldn't see them. And your engine would set off the mine under your vessel, and that would be that.
How old were you when you left Ireland?
I was 21.
Where did you live? Where have you lived since leaving Ireland besides Newton?
Besides Newton, when I was first married, I lived in Dorchester and Jamaica Plain.
How do you choose Newton? How do you choose living in Newton overall?
The reason I came to Newton was I took a shore job, and having a background with marine engines and boilers, I became super for the Home for Little Wanderers. And we had twin marine boilers there that when we shut one down, we always had one active to keep steam up for the children and heat and food. But they were beginning to put a wing on, a new wing for $2.5 million in 1958. And one of the counselors came from Newton but he was also a teacher in Needham. And they were going to lay him off. And I said to him, we're going to need extra help here. We have to move file cabinets, desks, all kinds of furniture. And I said, would you like to go laboring? It would pay a lot more money than a counselor. He said, oh, I'd love to do that. So I went to the director, and they only wanted to pay him minimum counselor wages. I said, he's going to get laborer's wages. It's hard work. And he did, and we became good friends. And turns out his profession was a teacher, and he was teaching in Needham for 40 years. Actually, he taught my present wife's grandchildren in Needham. And I'll tell you how the first time after I got him the job, I had 4 or 5 station wagons I maintained, belonged to the Home for Little Wanderers. And we were sitting in one of the wagons, and it was Friday. And I took a bite out of my sandwich and I spat it out. He said, what's the matter? I said, it's Friday. He said, try what? He said, here, try some of mine. And I took his sandwich, I took a bite over and I spat that one out. He said, what's the matter with you? He said, my mother made that this morning, it's fresh. I said, today is Friday and I'm a Roman Catholic. He said, oh, well, he said, I'm Protestant. I'm a Congregationalist. I said, okay. So he said, well, what's wrong with Friday? I said, it's a sin for me to eat meat on Friday. I said, we have 2 kinds of sins, mortal and venial. He said, would you say wasting food is a mortal sin? I said, well, yeah. He said, so you don't want to commit a mortal sin, so why don't you finish the sandwich? And I said, gee, I never thought of that. And for the first time ever, I heard Henry Hank Janaski laugh, and he had a contagious laugh. Actually, my present surgeon, doctor, has the same type of laugh, and I do tell him a joke once in a while, just to hear him laugh. We became good friends. He had a friend that was also a teacher that used to teach in Wayland. And they were friends since they were 5 years old. And both teachers, one in Wayland, one in Needham.
What was it like when you first arrived to your new home, like in Newton?
In Newton?
Mm-hmm.
My introduction to Newton was in the winter, and before I moved to Newton, I had my days of wine and roses. And when I seen where I lived, after the grace of God had entered my life, and I went into a program, I said to my wife, how long have we lived here? She said, 6 years. I says, you gotta be kidding. She said, it started, we got the first snowfall, and she said, I want to show you the children's room. And the snow was coming through. The frames were rotted, and the snow was coming through from outside, piling up on the windowsill. And I was broken-hearted when I seen, because I had missed the sea so much. I started to drink a little more and a little more. And Hank Janaski used to follow me around, the Newton kid, and try to get me to go home. Now I see where I live, and I said, I'll have you out of here in the springtime. As a matter of fact, I went down and got plaster of Paris. I was trolling up the window frames. And the neighbor across the street in a tree decker thought I was putting up Christmas decorations. But anyhow, Hank invited me to Newton because he wanted his parents to meet with me. And in Jamaica Plain, they never plowed the streets. I went to Newton, the streets were all plowed. The sidewalks were plowed. I'm looking, I was in another world. And I said, wow, look at this place. You know, I could see the sidewalks, the roads were all done, nice homes, and I'm in an awe. And when I came home, I said to my wife, we're going to move to Newton. She said, do you know who lives in Newton? She said, the lawyers and doctors, professional people. I said, I don't care about that. We're going to move to Newton. And strange as it was, I owed a lot of money to the loan sharks and bad people, leg breakers. So what am I going to do? So I went down to the Coast Guard, and I got, for 2 days, I had to take command of a boat. For 2 days, I had oral and written exams, and I got my American license, and it was the proudest day of my life. Now, Hank Chinaski of Newton said, what are you going to do with that license? I said, I'm going away to sea. I can make $100,000 on a 6-month trip, and I can pay off my debts. And he was brokenhearted. And he told his parents about it. And they said, we want to meet him. And when they met me, they said, would you maintain the Congregational Church for us? We need a good maintenance man. Hank hates to see you go away to sea. And for 12 years, I maintained it. And from there, I built up Conneely Painting. I had another company, Home and Industrial Maintenance, and we did yacht repair work at the shipyards, and I bought a beautiful home in West Newton, and my dream came true.
That's great. What can you do? Was it difficult transitioning from Ireland to the U.S.?
To which?
To the U.S., like transitioning.
I was more at home in the United States than I ever was in Britain. Mm-hmm. I could understand people when they spoke. We were in Britain. While I think of it, the purest English in the English-speaking world is spoken in Dublin, Ireland, not in England. And that's a fact. It's in the Guinness Book of Records.
Can you describe someone some of the cultural differences you've noticed between Ireland and the United States?
I couldn't see any difference except the throw on the other side of the road.
Is there anything else that you could elaborate more on, like, if there's any cultural differences between the people, maybe?
I found that the Bostonians were aloof, actually almost snobbish. And the first time I went on a streetcar, I never seen a streetcar, by the way, until I came to Boston. I stood up to let a lady have the seat I was at. And she went up one side of me and down the other. And she told me she wasn't a cripple, and how dare I. And my girlfriend, who became my wife, my Irish wife, said, you're not in Ireland now. And I would say good morning to somebody in Boston, and they looked at you like they smelled something bad. And I found Bostonians very aloof and not very friendly to people unless they knew who you were. You were kind of treated with suspicion, yeah. Especially if you had an Irish accent.
Are there any similarities you've noticed between Ireland and the United States?
Yes, you have the rivers. My hometown had 5 bridges across it. I found Boston had several bridges across the Charles, and the islands. Galway Bay had its islands. the lighthouses, everything was very similar.
Can you describe any traditions you have started or held onto since moving here?
The which?
Like any traditions that maybe you've started since moving here?
Traditions?
Yeah.
Halloween came from Ireland, so you didn't start that one, so I was quite, comfortable with that. Thanksgiving, because of the terrible things was happening in the north of Ireland to my countrymen, the British government had 2.5 million Roman Catholics squeezed into one corner. If you were Roman Catholic, you couldn't have a civil service job. You couldn't belong to a gun club. You couldn't own property in the Protestant areas. You couldn't work where the Titanic was built, in that shipyard. All these restrictions, and I found I never liked bullies, and to me the British government were bullies. What they did, they brought in all the Scots English into the north of Ireland, repossessed the Irish, the native Irish, took their lands, their farms away, and gave it to the Scots and the English, and said, hold this ground with a crown. And they happened to be non-Catholics, and this is where you had the Protestant and Catholic head to head. And I seen this, and I felt the British lash myself when they dropped my merchant marine license, because it was issued by the Irish Ministry of Transport. They wouldn't let me get back on my ship, which was a Scottish motor ship. And my skipper, who was a Scot, said, I'm not leaving you on the beach, lad. They won't beat you up, they will kill you. And I wouldn't have that on my conscience. And it was a dangerous place for a young merchant mariner in those years.
Would you mind sharing a story of your first experience? Well, you already speak English, but did you also speak Irish? Do you speak Irish as well?
I have what they call a school Irish. But there's 4 dialects. There's 4 provinces in Ireland. And each Celtic language was a little variance, like with the Scots. On the islands and the Hebrides, I could converse with the Scottish merchant mariners. And there was a favorite word that they used when things weren't going right, and it was jowl. Jowl is like the Spanish for devil, diablo. So all you'd hear is jowl, jowl, when things weren't going right. And the Irish language, as I say, it was like we never used it when we came outside of school, because everyone spoke English, maybe with different accents, but they spoke English. And like the Scots would say, if they didn't understand something, they'd say, I dinna ken. I dinna ken means I don't know. But you had to get into the native vocabulary, and you learn a lot through that. Even some of the Irish, some words I didn't understand, but they had their own, like in the fishing village of the Claddagh, where I come from, the Claddagh Ring. They had their own lingo. They never said, they cut their hand, they reefed their hand. They weren't sick, they were laid up. They didn't say who hit you, it was who hot you. And it wasn't a door, it was a doer, right? So they had their own, kind of dialect.
What were your hopes for yourself when you came here? Did you live any of your hopes out, I guess, when coming to the U.S.?
The reason I came to the United States is my girl I had talked her into coming to the United States. Her people were famine people that got wrecked on Nantucket Shoals in the 1840s. They married into whaling people who were Quakers. To this day, they still own the island fish market in Nantucket, the family. And through the association, I told her to go to Nantucket, and she wrote to me, and when they come to Nantucket and Boston, and I said I'd go for a year, and I did, and I got married, but I wasn't happy, and I went back to Ireland in 1956, and I brought my youngest daughter with me at the time, my first daughter, and I was torn between my love for the sea and my love for my wife Winnie, and I came back to the States, but that's when I entered the fog of alcoholism.
What was your idea of America or Newton? Was it like the same, or has it changed?
What I was amazed at when I landed in the fall of 1953 was the blue skies. All I could see was blue. Where I came from an island that was cloud covered, you could look distance, and I loved that. And the trees, especially in Newton, I was amazed at what I was looking at. Yes.
What was the most important and meaningful event you've experienced in your life?
The most important experience? In the United States?
Just in your lifetime.
In what?
In your life.
My daughter went to school in Newton. All my family went to school in Newton. And she came home from school one day and she said, "Dad, I got to do a paper for the Newton schools on what was called the storm of the century." I said, "January 31st, 1953. She said, "Dad, how did you know that?" I said, "I was in it. 3 days adrift in the North Sea. We lost all power. We were posted missing. All radio communication, we'd lost all our power. The seas were cleared our masthead at 80 feet. We drifted into the old Dutch minefields. We tried to get our lifeboats in the water with the old round bar type davits that swung out like this, like two arms. The seas had bent those steel round bar davits that you wouldn't believe, like they were spaghetti. We couldn't get our lifeboats in the water. The skipper and the chief engineer got into it, and the chief engineer went out, and he got extra time. On the third day of that night, my skipper said to me, "Patrick, we got to get down those electric lights. We have no power. Could you run up kerosene ones?" I had to look forward 500 feet. The ship is all awash. And the scream of the wind. I went to see The Perfect Storm. And when I came out of there, my wife said, "What do you think?" I said, "Hollywood screwed up." She said, "What do you mean?" I said, "They didn't have the sound of the wind and the rigging like I really heard it." I said, "It was like people crying in the wind, moaning and woo." terrible sounds, and sounds like drums beating, or freight trains running crazy. And now I'm asked to go up to the forepeak. And a young kid from the Scottish Hymnody said, "Patrick, you're not going alone, I'm going with you." So we have a plan. We will run to a storm lasher across our hatches, 10 feet, run to the next 10 feet, hang on, take a deep breath, and we worked our way all the way to the forepeak. We got up there, the lamps were all ready to go. There was matches there, you lighted in the shelter of the forepeak, and we couldn't get down the electric ones. The halyards were all woven up tight. So here we are, struggling not to be washed overboard, and I looked towards the bridge where I could see it, and I see the chief mate with the megaphone trying to hang on to the megaphone. We couldn't hear what he was saying. And then I felt a pulsation under my feet, and I looked at Mac, and I said, "I think they got her going." We could feel motion, and she swung into it. And the waterfall came at both of us, and we were both arse over tea kettle washed aft. And we were 7 weeks in dry dock with all the damage done to that ship, but we survived.
What is your sweetest childhood memory?
Pardon, lovey.
Your
My hearing is a little off.
What was your sweetest childhood memory? Like, if you have one.
My
childhood memory?
Childhood memories. We're going back a ways long. I don't know if I ever was a child, because when I went to sea, I was 10 years old. I'm trying to think as a child. As I said, I was born on the docks, and I had a harness on. The reason I had a harness, that I was tied to a gas light. There was no electricity, it was all gas lights. And I was tied to the light pole because I was falling in the harbour all the time. Or I used to get in among the cattle. They used shipping, and I'd be covered from head to toe with sweet violets. And I had a skirt on. They kept a skirt on until you were 7 or 8 years old. And I had this harness, and my dad was a marine engineer, and people would come to our home. We're right on the harbour. Coming into the harbour, our house would be the first boat you would see, or the first house you would see. So people would come and ask him problems with their engines, and he stepped out. He was babysitting with me. I, at 4 years old, was looking for a ball underneath my bed. And the newspaper flared up, and I threw it into the tea chest, which was coal in there. The tea chest wasn't on fire. The house was called the Yankee House because all made of wood. And on one end of it, they kept lifeboats and sails, tar, oil, paints. Everything went up. My dad tried to get me. The fire department was right there, and they pulled on my rope, the harness, and they pulled me out of there, right? Mm-hmm. And nobody would believe me that I was the one that set the house on fire to this day. But then we had to move to the Claddagh fishing village, and we weren't welcome there because we were trawler people. And they were like Amish people. They had their own king, their own rules. The police never went in there. They married into one another, and they were brutal to us. And my real fond memories was going out in the dory through the big trawler, and going down and finding condensed milk, which I liked, and stuff like that. But that were my memories.
What has your experience living in the United States been like? You've already kind of answered this, but if there's anything that's a little bit different living here than in Ireland at all, I guess.
I actually didn't find any difference in my living in the United States. The weather I loved, the seasons here. In Ireland you had continuous showers, limited sunshine, like I said, and clouds. But I found the air different. I thought I was going to smother because I was used to salt air. And I wasn't getting it. Actually, 18 years ago, I moved to Plymouth, and the first thing I noticed was the air quality was better than in Newton. And even my wife, a Newton girl, she said, you're right, the air is better. And it is.
Can you think of any common values or beliefs your practices that would help people understand like the culture in Ireland? Anything like you of common value maybe?
I think common values was family. We all sat down and had dinner together. There was more communication verbally. There was no interruptions with TV at the time, or radio. And I felt that the families were closer together, and respect. Your children were taught to open the door for the elderly or help somebody, to say, please, thank you, excuse me. All these values in those days were handed down from family to family. But respect was the main thing, especially for the elderly.
What advice would you give to somebody moving from Ireland to the United States?
I would tell them, don't move with the idea that you're going to live there right away. I would say spend at least 6 months to a year in the United States. Feel your way through. Don't make any decisions till you spend some time in these United States.
Is there anything that we haven't covered that you would like to share with us?
I haven't covered. I want to say this. When I met Hank Janaski and his friend Timmy Kinsley, both teachers, that spoke a lot about education. And Hank used to laugh because sometimes my spelling was different than his. I would say progress, and he would say progress. We get into that bit. Pronunciation. Anyhow, they spoke a lot about education, and I wanted my children to have the best education. And the best education I found out from both Hank and other people and Timmy Kinsler was right here in Newton. And I wanted my children to have the best education. My sisters in Ireland got a great education. One of them became the Vicaress General in Rome, the highest you can go in a nunnery. The other one was a Franciscan nun, and who used to write poems too, because the Conneelys came from generations of poets. But Hank Janowski opened my eyes and the importance of education. And Newton was one of the best, if not the best, in the United States for education and safety. Crime was low. And I wanted my children to have the best education that they could get, and they got it. My oldest girl became a social worker and an investigator for the state of abused children. I'd seen where she had to go because my Sturgeon man didn't show up in East Boston, and I had to go in the projects looking for him. And it's 5 o'clock in the morning, and I could smell booze going the hallways and smoke, and I knew that was my oldest girl's beat. That was her area, or part of her area. And I said, Mary should have a gun. She's going in these dark hallways and everything. And she was a pretty girl. And I said it to her, and she said, Dad, they would shoot me with the gun. But she said, they know who I am, and don't want to miss their welfare check or whatever. And finally, she was a very, very brave girl. Sadly, she died of cancer and is buried in Newton Cemetery, and so is my wife and my granddaughter. And 2 years ago, my granddaughter OD'd. And I had written The Street of Regret. I had written a lot of poems with drugs and alcohol. And she told me, she called me 2 weeks before she died. She said, Dad Joe, she said, your poems gives me great comfort. And I had great feeling that she was going to be all right because she had a problem. Instead of that, after that 2 weeks, they found her dead. She was dead 3 or 4 days before they found her body. And she was a beautiful girl, and she got in with the wrong crowd. I am working currently with the chief of police in Pembroke because they have this problem there too. Actually, I dropped off 100 poems of The Street of Regret, which I had written, and just one. And I wrote The Street of Regret for a young man that had a drug problem and a drinking problem. They followed a trail at the yacht club down to his sailboat. He had a beautiful sailboat. He was the joke of the yacht club. And the board of directors wanted to throw him out of the yacht club. And we thought he should get help. And this morning, we followed that trail of blood. Everybody was afraid to go aboard the boat. What he did, he forgot his key, and he couldn't get in to the east end of the club where his boat was. So he climbed over a razor wire, and he got wrapped up in it, and he's out of it. And he tore himself all up, his neck, his ears, his hands. And they were all afraid to go aboard his boat. And they asked Patrick, he always liked you, would you go and check on him? I didn't know whether I was going to find him living or dead. They found him in bad shape. I got him into a hospital. I got him into a program. And sadly, my home was wrecked in January 1996. A giant oak tree came down and belonged to a neighbor. Even though I asked him to limb it, he limbed his side, and all the weight was on my side. But the tree belonged to him, and it pushed my 11-room house on its foundation. It cracked the street in 5 places. And strangely, that morning, my wife said she was just after being operated on for cancer, and she had to go back into the hospital. And she said, that tree gives me the creeps. That night, I'm the only one in the house. And the giant oak tree, winds 90 miles an hour from the south, came down, and my house was condemned by the city of Newton, and my wife died and never came into that house again. And before she died, she said to me, would you write me something? You're always writing for people. She said, the oncologist told me I only got 4 to 6 weeks to live. Could you write me something? I said, let me think about it. I thought about the little boy going to sea, who was myself. I thought of the times I always said, so long for now, when I never said goodbye. It was always so long for now. I thought of all of this, and I put it together, and I call it The Sailor Boy. I put my own music to it. I used to sing tenor in the choir. I sang it in a studio. We put the sound of the wind in the ocean in the background. And I brought it into Brigham and Women's Hospital, and she learned to sing it, and she sang it every night before she went into a coma. The night nurse told me every night she sings that song. And if I never did anything the rest of my life, I was able to give her that much. Would you like me to recite it for you?
Yes, if you like to. Yes, please.
I was born the son of a seafaring man, and was destined to follow the sea. At night, as I lay on my pillow, the wind used to whisper to me, go to sleep, little lad, go to sleep, and dream of tall ships and the tide, for soon you must go where the stormy winds blow, and the sea you will take for your bride. So I sailed far away from old Galway Bay, south to Cape Horn and Peru, where we weathered some gales and we heard some tall tales from Galway to Fu Manchu. Now he becomes an old man, and the wind is whispering to him. Now the years they have fled, since the sea I have wed, and the wind softly whispers to me, go to sleep, old man, go to sleep, and dream of that distant shore, where your days are all true, sailing on the blue with shipmates forevermore. And that's the Sailor Boy.
That's amazing. Thank you so much. It looks like our time is just about up. What is one more thing you would like people 100 years from now to know about the time in your service, in the service?
In the service?
Yeah. Or just in general, really, in your lifetime.
What I feel, and I was asked this before, what would you like your legacy to be? I said, I'd like to be remembered for bringing joy and comfort to people and to mankind through my poems.
Thank you. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this with us. We were really happy to be able to include you in Newton Talks Oral History Project.